Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this video or this podcast, whatever we want to call it. I'm really pleased to be joined by my distinguished colleague, Dr. Zoltan Schwab. Zoltan is Assistant Director of Postgraduate Studies and the tutor in Old Testament at Spurgeon. So it's great to welcome Zoltan. And we're discussing a really important topic today. And we want to discuss how theology was dethroned. Theology used to be the queen of the sciences. It used to be at the top of the academic hierarchy. So in the medieval period, theology enjoyed status and authority and prestige, which is almost unthinkable, unimaginable today in this so-called secular world. But we want to discuss how theology became downgraded. What happened? So what's happened essentially in the last 1,000 years? Because theology has not enjoyed the status and prestige that it once had during the medieval period, at least since the Reformation. You remember that the great reformer Martin Luther criticized what he called the scholastic barbarism of medieval scholastic theology, that it was only concerned with abstract metaphysical categories that had no relation to the real everyday life of Christians. So theology has been under attack for several centuries on many different fronts. And we want to understand the processes through which theology became downgraded. So I'm just going to discuss this issue with Zoltan. I think, Zoltan, probably a good place to begin is the Enlightenment. This period of revolution, a revolution in the forms of thought that occurred in Europe primarily from around about the year 1650, and which lasted until around the year 1800. And, you know, if we're thinking about how theology transitioned from being the queen of the sciences to the court jester, thinking about how theology became marginalized in the Western academy, then I think that although we can trace the decline back to the Reformation, it really is the Enlightenment when theology suffered its most sustained criticism, was subject to a really focused and sustained critique. I just wondered, Zoltan, with your specialism in biblical studies, wondered if you had any thoughts about how the Enlightenment changed public perceptions, and especially perceptions in the academy, of the Bible, so the authority and the status of Scripture. How did Enlightenment influence this from your perspective?
Well, I think a key word, if you want to understand how people influenced by the Enlightenment thought and what kind of thinking led to the marginalization of theology and biblical studies, if you are asking about that, the key word is liberation, because that's what especially academics experienced in the Enlightenment. They felt oppressed by the church. Their perception was that what they were allowed to think and what they were not allowed to think was dictated by the church, and they wanted to be liberated. And in this, you could say that the Enlightenment, at least in certain respects, was following on the Reformation, which you just mentioned, because during Reformation, the reformers also wanted to be liberated in their biblical interpretation. They wanted to follow the Bible and not what certain church authorities taught about the Bible. That's and right. Some Enlightenment thinkers said, and in fact many people have made this argument, that the Enlightenment simply followed this trajectory. And they said that, well, we just want to understand the Bible as it is, and we don't want the church to prescribe to us what the Bible says. So if you understand this, that for these people it was about liberation, we can sympathize with them, especially as a Protestant theologian. I can understand their motivations. Now, it didn't work out really well, I think. So I highly disagree with what actually happened and with what they actually did. But at least I do understand their motivations and their feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as Christians, we obviously have a very different perspective on these issues, because the basic impulse of Enlightenment was secularization, as you've put it, I think really helpfully, this desire to be liberated from the constraints and from the authority of theological institutions, or institutions that were associated with the church. And I think that while we can disagree with the conclusions that were reached, we can perhaps try to sympathize with some of the impulses that lay behind it, because the Enlightenment was an incredible phenomenon. And we're grateful to the Enlightenment for the birth of modern science and modern medicine, and just how much we rely on modern science, especially during a period of a global pandemic, for example. So we don't want to completely denigrate the Enlightenment. We want to acknowledge its tremendous contribution to the development of science and civilization.
Yes.
And also acknowledge the ways in which the Enlightenment actually instigated a revolution in philosophical anthropology. So the whole way that we think about what it means to be a human being, there are really important implications there for us as theologians, as well as just more generally as academics.
Yes, and it is very helpful that what you just said, because in my experience in Christian circles, the Enlightenment has a really bad reputation. It shouldn't have that reputation. It inevitably, as every intellectual movement, it caused some problems. It is a cause of some problems, and some major problems. But as you've just said, it has contributed immensely to us. If I think about my subject area, biblical studies, that kind of historical consciousness which developed in the Enlightenment, so that people are aware how different they are from other cultures and previous cultures and people in previous era, how different their concerns, questions are. This is very helpful for understanding the Bible. I mean, it also caused a lot of problems to theology, I think. But at the same time, it's also, so I do use in my studies a lot of techniques, methods which were developed in the Enlightenment.
Yeah, no, thanks, Zoltan. I think that's a helpful approach, and perhaps as Christians, as theologians, we need to nuance our response to the Enlightenment. So, on the one hand, avoiding uncritical acceptance of the secular agenda and the hostility towards theology, but at the same time, avoiding just outright unthinking repudiation. And taking a more nuanced approach to its to some of the benefits, as well as
yes. But let me just add one thing, because now I feel that so far we've been praising the Enlightenment. So just be a little bit more critical and to react to what I said about liberation. Yes. And I said that I fully understand and I resonate with this instinct of many Enlightenment thinking. At the same time, as as a Christian theologian, or at least part of my response would be that what some of these thinkers probably didn't understand is that liberation doesn't mean being free to think whatever you want to think.
Yeah.
Partly because it's impossible. You cannot think whatever you want to think. You are always influenced by your society, by your colleagues, and by the expectations of people and all that. So I think in Christian theology, freedom is not the freedom to think whatever you want to think, but freedom is to think within a right relationship. To have a right relationship with God and with other human beings and with the whole creation. And in that context, to think that is freedom.
Yes.
And I think this is a significant difference between how Christians, I think, should understand freedom and how perhaps naively Enlightenment thinkers tended to understand freedom, that freedom is that you just do whatever you want to do and there are no constraints. Such existence doesn't exist. You are always constrained. The question is how you are constrained.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, Zoltan. This issue of freedom is obviously paramount to Christian theology. If we think about all the exhortations in the New Testament to live in the freedom of Christ, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But there's also restraint, isn't there? There's an interesting dialectic. So it's not just freedom to do what we want, but freedom within the prescribed limits of what God has ordained. I think that's an important point, that we avoid this trap of negative freedom. I remember Isaiah Berlin, when he was writing about the Enlightenment, he used to allude to this concept of negative freedom, the absence of restraint, but restraint. But as Christians, we have a more positive understanding of freedom. We don't want to be free from God. We want to be free to serve God and to serve the coming of the kingdom of God into the world. But I think it's helpful to, as you say, to take a more critical perspective on Enlightenment, because I think there are some perhaps more benign manifestations of Enlightenment, but then there are also some more hostile manifestations. So we've spoken about this new focus on science. Unfortunately, many of the leading Enlightenment thinkers were, in some cases, they were atheists, like Denis Diderot or Baron d'Holbach. Some of these figures were very, very hostile to Christianity. There were others like Voltaire, who was perhaps more of a deist. Isaac Newton as well, to some extent, would fit into that category.
Sorry, Newton wrote more about the Bible than about physics. So,
well, yes, but he had some rather esoteric theories about the Bible and end time prophecy, as far as I remember. The Bible is some kind of code of numbers which needs to be cracked in order to predict the date of doomsday and all that sort of thing. But I think, generally speaking, the Enlightenment thinkers were rather hostile to Christianity, or at least revealed religion in general. I remember, I think it was the French Enlightenment thinker Denis Diderot, who lived from 1730 to 1784, and he said that graduates of theology faculties are the most useless, intractable, and dangerous students in the whole of the university. And
sometimes I think that he had a point, actually. Yes.
Well, possibly, but I think he meant it as an insult. But actually, on the subject of insult, it was Denis Diderot's collaborator and friend, the Baron de Holbach, that I referred to earlier. He regarded theology as, quote, an insult to human reason. So, you know, these thinkers, they were quite upfront and open about their hostility to Christian belief and to theology in particular. So theology was not regarded with respect. It wasn't even admitted into the realm of the sciences. And the problem for the Enlightenment was that theology was seen to be founded on myths and traditions rather than upon some universal system of rational thought. And you know, this, from the Enlightenment perspective, was the main problem with theology. And I think with the Enlightenment, there was this tendency towards the secularization of learning, the secularization of knowledge. So back in the medieval time, when theology was regarded not just as one academic discipline or a faculty within a family of disciplines, theology was regarded as the point of departure for all forms of knowledge. So if you wanted to learn about law, then theology would be a core part of the curriculum. If you wanted to learn about medicine and practice, you know, to become a physician, then theology would have been a core part of the curriculum. And now, to say the least, that's not the case anymore. So we see with the Enlightenment this downgrading of theology, the secularization of knowledge. And I think, Zoltan, I think this would be an important point for you with your background in biblical studies. The Bible became downgraded because the Enlightenment supplanted divine revelation as the foundation of knowledge. So reason rather than revelation was seen as the starting point for knowledge. And this new attitude towards knowledge, this new epistemology, spilled over into a new critical perspective towards the Bible. So the Bible was no longer regarded as this sacred, inspired text, but it was just regarded as a historical account of you know, the human experience of the divine, however this was defined.
Yes. One result of this whole historical development and attack on theology, as you just described, is an interesting result, which we can experience today in the theology and religion departments throughout the country at different universities. What we can see today, and of course this will be a massive generalization, but I think what we can see today is that theology as such is not really taught at these departments. They teach the history of faith. They teach the psychology of faith. What are the psychological motivations behind the faith of certain people or behind the atheism of certain people? They teach the sociology of faith, how social developments affect the faith life of communities, etc. What they don't teach is faith. So you could say that they teach the history of theology, the sociology of theology, the psychology of theology, the politics of theology, and so on and so forth. What they don't teach is theology. And by theology, I mean the God question. Is there a God or not? This question is not really addressed at theology departments. If there is a God, then what sort of God he is? How shall we speak about that God? And if there is a God, then how could we describe the relationship between God and the creation? These questions are seldom asked. What they learn in these departments is the history of these questions, the political background of these questions, the historical background. So basically, there are very few theology departments. What we call theology departments is really history of theology departments, or the psychology of theology departments, or the sociology of theology departments. And I think this is partly a reaction to what you've described, that history, psychology, the science of politics and all that became reputable sciences or academic exercises. And that's why people involved in theology consciously and unconsciously drifted into doing these things. So very few people today actually do theology. Actually, Bible colleges are the places where theology is more done nowadays. But even in Bible colleges, we who teach at Bible colleges, we were trained, many of us were trained in those big theology departments. So even us who are trying to do theology, we are not trained in how to do theology. So as a biblical scholar, I was taught a lot about how to investigate the history of the Bible. But how to address the God question through studying the Bible, I wasn't taught about this. Well, that's exaggeration. I was taught about this, but not to the same extent.
No, I think that's a really good and perceptive point that you've made there, Zoltan. It perhaps points to the difference or the distinction that's sometimes made in the academy between theology on the one hand and religious studies. But I suspect that there's some truth in what you've said, at least speaking from my own experience, which mirrors yours to some extent, that even in theology faculties, there's actually very little theology that's actually being done. Theology in terms of really grappling with first order questions about the existence and nature of God and its meaning and implications. We don't usually address these issues in a normative way. We tend to address them in a historical or psychological or critical perspective, and we ask second order questions about, what did so-and-so theologian X think about God, without really ever addressing the issue of whether she or he was correct, whether they were right. And I think, just coming back to our discussion earlier about enlightenment, I think this is part of the legacy, for good or bad, for good or ill. This is part of the legacy of enlightenment, which permitted theology to ask certain questions, but not to ask first order questions about the nature of God, of the nature of goodness, of beauty and truth, the truth of divine revelation. And I think to some extent, 200-300 years later, we're still the children of the Enlightenment to some extent. And I think Enlightenment gave birth to a new movement within theology that regarded religion not so much as a direct encounter with a divine reality, but I think that theology was re-envisioned as the study of the human experience of the divine. So theology took a kind of subjective turn. So the idea was that theology no longer dealt with objective external realities. Theology was a matter of the believer's own personal experience of God. So I think that there are some interesting lessons there for us to learn. I think in our next video, Zoltan, we can perhaps continue the discussion and begin where we left off here, discussing the Enlightenment heritage and the birth of liberal theology. So I think we'll leave the discussion there.
Okay.
And we'd encourage everyone to stay tuned for the next installment. But my thanks to Zoltan.
Thank you.
And bye for now. Thank you.